There's a photograph that still exists, taken in 1891, a family portrait on a porch in eastern Kentucky, 17 people, all related, all smiling, and if you look closely at their faces, you begin to notice something that makes your skin crawl. The same jaw, the same eyes, the same narrow bridge of the nose appearing again and again, not just in siblings, but in parents and children who shouldn't look quite that similar. This isn't a family. This is an echo, a genetic echo that repeated itself for so long that it started to crack. The Fugate family didn't mean to become a medical curiosity. They didn't set out to create one of the most disturbing genetic experiments in American history. They were isolated, they were poor, and they were loyal to their own. But loyalty, when it turns inward for too long, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a trap, and the Fugates walked into that trap willingly, generation after generation, until their very blood began to betray them. You've probably never heard their name. Most people haven't, because this is the kind of story that gets buried. Not because it's violent, not because it's evil, but because it's uncomfortable. It forces us to ask questions about what happens when a family closes its circle too tightly. When the outside world becomes the enemy, when trust is only given to those who share your name and your face, and eventually your DNA. This is the story of a clan that lived deep in the Appalachian Hills, far from prying eyes, far from doctors, far from anyone who might have warned them what they were doing to themselves. They married their cousins. They had children with their kin, and slowly, over the course of 150 years, they turned blue, not metaphorically, literally. Their skin took on the color of a fading bruise, the color of oxygen, starved blood, the color of something dying from the inside out, and the worst part, they didn't even know it was wrong. To them, this was just how the Fugates looked. This was normal. This was family. It started with a man named Martin Fugate, a French immigrant who arrived in Kentucky around 1820. He came from across the ocean carrying nothing but a name and a secret written into his cells, a recessive gene so rare that most people live their entire lives without ever knowing it exists. But Martin Fugate knew, because Martin Fugate was blue, not entirely, not like something out of a fantasy novel, but his skin carried a faint discoloration, a grayish, blue tint that became more pronounced in cold weather, in dim light, in moments of stress. It was methemoglobinemia, a blood disorder where the hemoglobin in your veins can't carry oxygen the way it should. Your blood stays dark, stays blue, and that darkness shows through your skin like a stain that won't wash out. Martin settled in Troublesome Creek, Kentucky, a name that should have been a warning. He married a woman named Elizabeth Smith, a local girl, red-haired, pale, and by pure, cruel coincidence, she carried the same recessive gene he did. Neither of them knew. How could they? Genetics wasn't a word yet. DNA was still a century away from discovery. All they knew was that they loved each other, and that the hills around them were empty enough to build a life in private. They had 7 children. 4 of them were blue, visibly, unmistakably blue, and instead of panic, instead of horror, the family simply adapted, because what else could they do? There were no doctors who would come this far into the mountains. No specialists who understood blood disorders, so the Fugates did what isolated people always do. They normalized it, they made it part of the family identity. Blue skin wasn't a curse, it was just the Fugate way. And then those 4 blue children grew up, and they married, and because Troublesome Creek was so isolated, because the outside world felt so far away and so hostile, they married people they knew, people they trusted. People who were often their cousins, sometimes their second cousins, sometimes closer than that, and the gene didn't just survive, it thrived. It spread through the family tree like roots through poisoned soil, intertwining, doubling back, feeding on itself. By the time the Civil War ended, the Fugate family had become something else. They weren't just a family anymore. They were a closed system, a biological loop that kept feeding back into itself, and the blue skin wasn't fading. It was getting stronger, more common, more impossible to ignore. The children born in the 1860s and 70s didn't just have a tint. They were born with skin the color of a bruised plum, deep indigo lips, fingernails that looked like they'd been dipped in ink. And when they cried, when they screamed as infants do, their parents would hold them and whisper that it was all right, that this was normal, that this was what it meant to be a Fugate. But outside the family, people started to talk. Neighbors who lived miles away but still heard rumors, travelers who passed through troublesome creek and caught a glimpse of a blue child playing in a creek bed. The stories spread like wildfire through Appalachia. The blue people of Kentucky, a cursed bloodline, a family touched by something unnatural. And the more people talked, the more the Fugates retreated. They stopped going to town, stopped attending church, stopped pretending they were like everyone else. Isolation became protection, the hills became walls, and inside those walls, the family made its own rules. Cousin married cousin, uncle married niece in some cases, though no one kept perfect records. No one wanted to, because once you write it down, once you make it official, you have to look at what you've done. You have to face the math, and the math was damning. By 1900, nearly every Fugate carried the gene. The ones who weren't blue were carriers, and when two carriers had children, the odds were simple and brutal. 1 in 4 would be blue. 1 in 2 would carry it forward. 1 in 4 might escape entirely, but escape meant leaving, and leaving meant betraying the only people who understood you, the only people who didn't stare, the only people who looked like you. So they stayed, generation after generation. They stayed in troublesome creek, and they married each other, and they had blue children, and they told themselves this was love. This was loyalty. This was family, and maybe it was, but it was also something darker, something that doesn't have a kind name. The first time a doctor saw one of them, he thought the child was dying. It was 1960. A woman named Luna Fugate walked into a clinic holding her newborn son. The baby's skin was almost navy blue. His lips were purple. His fingernails looked black. The doctor took one look and started preparing for an emergency. Heart defect, oxygen deprivation, something catastrophic. He ran tests, checked the heart, checked the lungs, checked everything, and found nothing wrong. The baby was healthy, breathing fine, heart beating steady. But his blood was dark, almost brown when it should have been red. The doctor had never seen anything like it. He called in specialists. They drew blood. They ran it through machines. And finally, someone recognized it. Methemoglobinemia, an inherited disorder so rare that most doctors went their entire careers without encountering a single case. And here was an entire family, an entire clan, all carrying it, all passing it down like a family recipe no one wanted but everyone inherited. The doctor asked Luna how long this had been happening. She looked at him with tired eyes and said, always. As far back as anyone could remember, there had been blue Fugates. Her grandfather was blue. Her father was blue, her brother was blue, and now her son. It wasn't a mystery to her. It was just the way things were, the way things had always been, but the doctor couldn't let it go. He started digging, tracing the family tree, interviewing relatives who lived scattered across the Kentucky hills, and what he found made him sick. Not because the Fugates were cruel, not because they were monsters, but because they were victims of their own isolation. Their own fear of the outside world, their own belief that blood was thicker than anything, thicker than health, thicker than future, thicker than the basic biological warning signs that were screaming at them to stop. He found records of marriages between first cousins that produced 6, 7, 8 children. He found families where every single child was a carrier. He found one branch of the family where 3 generations in a row had married within the same household. Uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, brother, in-law to sister, in-law after a spouse died. The family tree didn't branch, it tangled, it knotted, it strangled itself, and the doctor realized something that haunted him for the rest of his life. The Fugates weren't ignorant, they knew what they were doing. They just didn't think they had any other choice. Because here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. The Fugates weren't just isolated by geography. They were isolated by shame, by the way people looked at them, by the way children in town would point and whisper, by the way a blue-skinned boy was turned away from a schoolhouse in 1897 because the teacher said his appearance would frighten the other students. By the way, a blue girl was refused service at a store because the owner thought she carried disease. The world outside trouble, some creek didn't want them, didn't understand them, didn't try, and so the Fugates turned inward. They built their lives around each other because no one else would have them. And when you're told again and again that you're too strange, too wrong, too different to belong anywhere else, you start to believe it. You start to think that marrying your cousin isn't a compromise, it's the only option, the only way to find someone who won't flinch when they see you, the only way to build a family that doesn't look at you like you're broken. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of this story. The Fugates didn't create their own genetic trap because they were stupid or evil. They created it because they were rejected, because society pushed them so far into the margins that the margins became their entire world. And in that world, the rules were different. In that world, survival meant keeping everything inside the family, keeping the bloodline pure, not out of pride, but out of desperation. By the time the 1970s rolled around, there were still Fugates living in those hills. Still blue, still carrying the gene, but the world had changed, roads had been built, highways connected the mountains to the cities, television brought the outside world into even the most isolated homes. And slowly, painfully, the younger generation started to leave. They married outsiders. They had children with people who didn't carry the gene, and the blue began to fade, but it never disappeared entirely. Because genes don't forget, they wait, they hide, they sleep in the DNA of people who have no idea they're carrying them. And someday, maybe generations from now, 2 people will meet and fall in love and have a child. And that child will be born with blue skin, and the parents will be terrified, and the doctors will be baffled, until someone digs deep enough into the family history and finds a name buried there, Fugate. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have left, or would you have stayed? There's a woman still alive today. Her name is being kept private, but she's in her 70s now, a descendant of the Fugates, and she remembers what it was like growing up in a house where half the family had blue-tinted skin and no one talked about it. She remembers her grandfather sitting on the porch in the summer heat, his hands almost purple in the fading light. She remembers her uncle who refused to go into town unless it was overcast because the sunlight made the discoloration worse. She remembers being told again and again, don't marry a Fugate, don't marry anyone from Troublesome Creek, get out, break the cycle, and she did. She married a man from Ohio, had 3 children, none of them blue, none of them carriers, as far as the genetic tests could tell. But she says she still has nightmares, dreams where she's holding a newborn and the baby's skin is darker than it should be, dreams where she looks in the mirror and sees her own lips turning indigo, Dreams where the gene catches up to her even though she escaped, because that's what happens when your family history is written in your blood. You can run from it, you can marry outside it, you can move 1,000 miles away. But you can't unlearn what you carry. You can't forget that somewhere in your cells, in the sequences of DNA that make you who you are, there's an echo of Troublesome Creek. An echo of Martin Fugate stepping off a boat in 1820 with a secret he didn't even know he was carrying. An echo of Elizabeth Smith, red-haired and pale, who just happened to carry the same silent curse. An echo of 150 years of people who loved each other so much, or were so afraid of the world beyond the hills, that they turned their family into a closed loop. A trap, a genetic prison. The last confirmed case of a blue fugate was in 1982, a boy born in a hospital in Hazard, Kentucky. The doctors knew what it was immediately by then. They'd been taught about the fugates in medical school. A cautionary tale about what happens when populations become too isolated, too insular, too afraid to let new blood in. The boy was treated, given methylene blue injections that temporarily corrected the disorder. His skin turned pink, normal, human, but only temporarily, because you can't cure what's written into every cell of your body. You can only mask it, manage it, live with it, and hope that your children don't inherit the same sentence. The Fugate family cemetery still exists. It's on a hillside in eastern Kentucky, overgrown now, mostly forgotten. The graves are simple, rough stones, names and dates carved by hand. Some of the graves don't even have names anymore. The weather wore them away, time erased them, but they're still there, still holding the bones of people who were born blue and died blue and spent their entire lives in a 10-mile radius because the world beyond that was too frightening, too cruel, too quick to judge. And if you stand there long enough in the quiet, you start to understand something that's hard to accept. The Fugates weren't monsters. They were just people. People who made choices that seemed rational at the time. People who loved their children enough to lie to them about what was normal. People who stayed loyal to their blood because their blood was all they had. And that loyalty, that devotion, that refusal to abandon each other, it destroyed them. Slowly, quietly, across generations, this is what happens when fear becomes a family trait, when isolation becomes inheritance, when the walls you build to protect yourself become the walls that trap you. The Fugates didn't accidentally create their own genetic echo. They chose it. Every single generation chose it, because the alternative was too painful. The alternative was admitting that staying together was killing them. That love, when it has nowhere else to go, turns inward and starts to consume itself. There are other families like this, not with blue skin, maybe, but with other secrets, other genetic time bombs, other closed circles that have been turning for so long that no one remembers how to stop. Families in the mountains, families on islands, families in small towns where everyone knows everyone and outsiders aren't welcome. Families that have been marrying their own for so long that the family tree looks more like a wreath. And they all tell themselves the same lie, that this is tradition, that this is loyalty, that this is love. But it's not love. It's fear, fear of change, fear of strangers, fear of what happens when you open the door and let the world in. And that fear writes itself into your children's DNA. It becomes part of who they are, part of what they pass down. A genetic echo that repeats and repeats until someone finally has the courage to walk away. The Fugates are mostly gone now, scattered, diluted, absorbed into the wider world, but the gene is still out there, sleeping, waiting, carried by people who have no idea what's hiding in their blood. And one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe 100 years from now, two people will meet, they'll fall in love, they'll have a child, and that child will be born blue, and the doctors will pull up old records, old case studies, old photographs of a family that lived in the hills of Kentucky and accidentally created their own genetic prison, and someone will whisper the name, Fugate, and the echo will start again. This is what we inherit, not just eye color, not just height, but choices, fears, the consequences of what our ancestors were too afraid to face. And the only way to break that cycle is to look at it. To name it, to refuse to let it define us. The Fugates couldn't do that, but maybe we can.